So anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is talk about project managing your thesis or your dissertation. And really, it's not about fully understanding the intricacies of project management. That's quite an interesting, I guess, field set of tools in itself, but it's taking advice from project management professionals and applying it to decisions and processes and understanding milestones and so forth that we as researchers would use. The objectives for tonight are really about having some familiarity with basic project management principles and applying these to the challenges that we face in terms of a thesis or a dissertation. Now, the first thing that I think is good to ask is, what do you consider to be a typical challenge, or what are the typical challenges that we all face as part of writing our thesis or our dissertation? And it's important to think that these vary. I've worked with some of you guys who are in the Zoom chat with us tonight. Some of you have issues with your supervisor. Some of you have, oh, sorry, challenges with your supervisor. Some of you have challenges with data collection, with trying to narrow down or really define your research gap. Others, like me, I have challenges with time management. I know how to construct a project and get it done, but can I do it, over a period of time? No, I'll leave it to the last minute and then I'll rush. We all have different challenges, and project management tools, project management ideas can help us work through and come to manageable solutions and approaches for this. If we sort of cobble everything together, because tonight I'm going to talk about a variety of different scenarios, and I'm then going to put it together and showcase how they link to project management. But if we cobble all of this together and pick and choose wisely, we should be in a position to be able to structure how we want to set up the next 6 months or the next year and actually meet our objectives with our research planning. And ultimately, the objective is get that PhD rather than everything else. But we should be able to set ourselves up to make sure that happens. Now, I'm going to start off because I mentioned supervision. So I'm going to start off with a challenge and a challenge with supervision. So what problems can arise with one supervisor? And, this varies. You can simply be, they're difficult to get hold of. So maybe you don't have the type of quality face-to-face time that you would like with them. Maybe they are very, I want to use the word pig-headed. I think that the correct term is stubborn. And by being stubborn, they really want you to go a certain way and are not necessarily giving you that academic freedom for you to say, you know what, I prefer to go this way. Others may just not really be invested. And that happens, unfortunately. You might be unlucky enough to get a supervisor that has to supervise you because that's what the university said, but they really don't bother that much about your research. So, of course, they are not in the best mental framework to be able to inspire or to motivate you. Or worse, other situations. What happens when one of your supervisors changes jobs? Or worse still, passes away and suddenly you don't even have a supervisor. So there are a number of problems that can happen. We can't predict what all of them will be, but we can think through how we're going to deal with them. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. The supervisor gives you less help and direction than you expected. And this is not an uncommon thing. I think back to my own supervisor when I started my PhD journey. And one of the interesting things was I'd been teaching. So I was not unfamiliar with the university. I was not unfamiliar with how things went. But I was teaching undergraduate. So, handhold, do all of that. My master's degree experience was really light and easy. I met my supervisor a few times. We had the occasional cup of coffee. I just went off and did what I wanted. But when I struggled, I always had the chance to email or to pop into their offices and say, hey, I need something. When I started my doctoral research, I remember going across the campus, meeting the guy. So my first doctoral supervisor was the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Massey University at the time. And he was a really nice guy. I've had interactions with him previously because he actually sent me books when I was doing my master's, books that he'd written. He sent them to me. It's like, oh, you might find these useful. And I remember going into his office and talking about what I wanted to do. So I'd had my sort of initial 2-page, 3-page proposal, sort of outlining where I thought, but not going very deep as one does. I went into his office, proposal's fine. He picked a book off the bookcase, passed it to me and said, oh, read this. And I didn't hear from him for 6 months. And apparently reading that book was meant to be his guidance for me. And then I was meant to stimulate ideas out of that. And at the time, I didn't realize it. I hadn't fully understood the fact that that's what I should have been doing. But what, or the relevance coming from this is, look, both parties in a supervision candidate experience, both parties have their own personalities, sometimes very strong personalities, sometimes very rigid frameworks. And what becomes important is understanding how each other works. But more importantly, the project management principle that comes into it is setting standards of engagement. So when I started with my PhD with Rolf, I never actually said to him, this is the support that I need. This is what I hope to get out of you. And he never said, this is my style. This is how I supervise students or I supervise research candidates. So there was kind of this mismatch between how that happened. And it took a while for us to recognize that we actually had to have that conversation. Now, it's embarrassing. He's a Pro-Vice Chancellor. He should have known to have this conversation. But to be fair, he knew I'd been teaching for 5 years, so he probably thought I knew it as well. Regardless, the principle of setting those standards of engagement is extremely important. And even if we're partway through our journey and we haven't had this conversation with our supervisor, it's actually never too late. You need to know, or you need to be able to say, this is the type of support that I need. This is the type of feedback that I need. So I'm helping, I'm an unofficial supervisor for somebody within our community. Her PhD, her main supervisor gives very short little pieces of feedback occasionally on things. And she sends it to me and I write and I scribble over it and I ask lots of questions and all that. And she actually said to me a couple of weeks ago, I need your feedback more than I need hers because your feedback helps me think. It helps me ask questions of myself and it helps me evolve to where I want to go. And the problem is she's never sat down with her first supervisor and actually said, you know what, this is the type of feedback I want from you. So if you feel that your supervisor isn't giving you quite the direction you want, it's actually a very simple conversation. It may be a nerve-wracking conversation to roll up to their office and say, okay, I want to have this chat. But it is a very fundamental conversation that one can have. And it's simply setting the standards. How are you going to work together? Let's move to a second example. A supervisor has low interest in or disagrees with some fundamental aspect of your research project. And this happens. I know of people who their supervisors are pushing them towards quantitative, for example, or they're pushing them towards a very mainstream qualitative versus something that would actually get more nuanced results. This will always happen. In some cases, it might be your supervisor's trying to make the pathway as easy as possible for you. And I think we've got to respect that because that is, it's a good thing when that happens. But other times it may be, look, they just don't have enough of a connection yet with it. Now, the project management principle we're looking at here is how to achieve buy-in. Every stakeholder that you have within your research process needs to be able to achieve buy-in. How are you selling your project? How are you selling your ideas? If you want to do a very nuanced qualitative, say, for example, creative methods as a way of extending the richness of the data that you are collecting, how do you sell that to your supervisor? How do you lobby them? How do you convince them? How do you encourage them to say, you know what, Craig, you're right, you need to do it that way? And getting stakeholder buy-in at every level of your research is important. When you go out to do data collection, for example, you're going to be getting gatekeepers to help you. You're going to be getting respondents on side to say, yes, I want to spend my time and contribute to the research that you're doing. So the same has to apply when we talk to our supervisor. Maybe the university is set up that your supervisor is an administrative supervisor. So they sign the documents, they tick the boxes, they put you in touch with a few people. But at the end of the day, their subject expertise and yours may be a little bit different. How do you get that buy-in? What do you do? How do you frame it in such a way that they are going to be a little bit more excited about it or understand how they can contribute? Because maybe they're thinking, well, you've got a really cool project. It's not really as in my field as I'd like, but I'm here as a supervisor. They might be thinking, how do I help this research candidate? How can I contribute something meaningful to them? Because on the whole, most academics who are supervising students do actually want to contribute, even though you think they're like trying to sort of distance themselves from you. But it becomes your responsibility to really find a way that you lobby with them and you get them to accept. Now, there's two different parts of this particular slide. One is they disagree with an aspect of your research, which means you've got to showcase to them why your approach is actually either stronger than or more innovative than previous, and obviously then deserves the effort into it. But if they just have low interest, you've got to find something that connects them to it. Maybe the opportunity for publication that you lead, that they have their name on as second author might work. Maybe their interest is not in the research you're doing directly, but maybe their interest is in how you evolve the methodology. So that part of it becomes interesting to them. Now, all of this become, the challenges that we have or challenges that we can have with our supervision or our supervisors. But it's important to think, what do we have to do? So from a project management perspective, achieving buy-in is simply about getting the different people, in this case supervisors, more interested in what you're doing. So it's bridging your research to them. Let's take another example of what this should be. Again, with supervision, you and your supervisor have different expectations of what you should accomplish in your dissertation. Been there, done that. I think most of us here tonight have experienced this. And really, the project management principle becomes to find the scope of the project. Now, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to give some advice. Many of us at PhD level, well, actually even post PhD level, but many of us see a problem, we're enthusiastic about it, and we overcomplicate not only what the problem is, but we overcomplicate our approach to providing a resolution for that problem. And what that basically means is we create too much work for ourselves. Now, I'll be fair, I still do that, and I'm several years past, but I still do that. What we need to do is define the scope of the project so that we keep ourselves on focus. So once you've started looking at where the research gap is, where the literature is directing you, where the endless possibilities are, you've still got to sit down and say, out of all of this, which elements of this will make an interesting PhD experience? You don't have to put everything together. Simplifying the research that you are doing, simplifying the scope of your project does not stop you from getting the PhD. What it does is actually it empowers you to get that PhD because you're not overly complicating. You're not being twisted around in different contortions as you're trying to solve so many problems. Those extra problems are something you can publish about later. They are a post-PhD project that you can do, or even parallel to your doctorate, you can work on those, but keep the doctoral dissertation, clean, easy. It still has to meet a standard, but don't make it so complicated or so big that what should be a 3-year commitment becomes a 5-year commitment. So you might want to look at things like, how long should the project be? Well, I've just said 3 years. You really want to make sure that actually you can achieve data collection in 1 year and you can achieve analysis and write-up in 1 year. So even though you've got 3 years, even though you've got 3 years, we break the first one down into your proposal. We break the second one down into data collection. And if your data collection is taking anywhere over 9 months, you might have bitten off a little bit more than is reasonably expected. So maybe that's time to rethink the scope of the project. And then analysis, write up, tying everything together, another year for that is perfectly acceptable. You've got to know what are the standards that will be used to evaluate your work. Now, that's where your supervisor comes in, that's where the university comes in, that's where people like me come in and say, you know what, this is either too complicated or you're missing a key point, change around here. You need to know what parts of the dissertation will be delivered and when. And what I mean by that is, look, the world over, most of us these days work on a 5-chapter model. It's not exclusive. And if you're doing something different, not an issue. But if you are using the 5-chapter model, we know that chapters 1 to 3 are typically presented within the first year. We know that chapter 4 kind of evolves towards the end of the second year and chapter 5 becomes the third year. But then chapters 1, 2, and 3 get rewritten as well, all through that process. It's simply about being able to understand at what point you need to have these, at what point you need to put the frameworks for these to other people, whether that be your supervisors, whether that be conference presentations so you can get some feedback, or journal submissions so you can get some publication, and also get to see the state of play from other academics and so forth. So it's important to think about that. And you need to ask yourself, when will the dissertation be completed? Now, that seems like well, at the end of my PhD becomes the answer. But the truth here is, look, when you put together your dissertation and you submit it the first time round, you're not submitting it to go directly to your Viva. You're submitting it so you get some feedback on how you can make it more coherent before you edit it and then submit it to enable the Viva to happen, or to be recommended for your Viva to happen. So if I want to graduate by December 2024, working backwards, the first full version of my dissertation needs to be submitted June, July 2024 to allocate that buffer so that I can do some editing, I can take on board some suggestions, I can address things that I might have forgotten about or omitted or purposely left out. It becomes, useful to work backwards and think in that way. So I've got that time to meet those deadlines. Now, again, that's scope of the project, because if the goal is to have defended your Viva within 3 years, your research is going to take 2.5 years to make that genuinely happen. So we have to work back or backwards to think about it. Let's take another one. Another challenge, I think many of us will know this: supervisor very busy, leading to long waits for feedback. And the project management principle here is, look, identifying constraints. We need to know these because we need to do our planning. And you can't sort of rock up to your supervisor and say, well, how long does it take you to give me feedback? We talk to other research candidates and other collaborators of that particular supervisor, and find out for ourselves what the process of working with them is like. We can't manage our supervisor. It's not something that you're going to change their personality. But what you can do is recognizing that if it takes them 3 weeks on average to give feedback, you need to supply things to them earlier than you might supply to other people. And it also means that you've got to think through, wow, if I know that they're going to sit on it for a few weeks and I want to progress, how much progression can I do during that time? Or how can I engage with other people, mentors, for example, or other colleagues, to give me a bit of feedback so I can keep going while I'm waiting for feedback on something else? So knowing what the constraints are going to be are helpful. Yes, usually we find the constraints with our supervisor, but then we find constraints in other areas of the journey in terms of ethics approval. So I come from a university where I spent, where my career started. The ethics committee met every month. So there was never a constraint on getting approval for research projects, because every month the committee met, there was always an opportunity. I know of friends and colleagues who work in universities where the ethics committee meets once every 6 months. That means if you don't get your ethics approval in, you have to wait 6 months before the next meeting happens, which means you can't go out and do data collection for 6 months. Now, those constraints help us because we know, oh, okay, this is a hard deadline versus this is a soft deadline. And we have to make our planning in accordance with that. Now, let's look at another challenge of the dissertation. And we sort of touched upon this, the distant deadlines. So I hate deadlines. They do help me. I'm great at procrastinating, as I'm sure Farrell will tell you, and is sitting there nodding his head like this. Um, Having deadlines can be both beneficial for us, but it can also be a problem because sometimes we do put things off, but also the deadlines don't always align with everything else that we're trying to do. So I've started off with procrastination. I've got lots of time. Yes, yes, yes. And then suddenly, oh, I've got a billion things to do. Not always great. We need to avoid procrastination. I'm not the person to teach you how to do that because even now I still do. But we have to set standards of engagement for ourselves. And I think that's the important part is look, some things we can procrastinate, some things we can put off. But there are certain things that if we don't do them up front, there's no way we can make them happen further down the track. So we've got to be able to figure out, well, if I have these things, what techniques, what tools of persuasion for myself can I actually use to make sure I get started and I get things done? So certain things are like routinize your schedule as far as possible so that you're always working the same time of day or night. So use habit um, as a productivity tool rather than something that stops you working. Now, I want to share an example here that I think was really quite valuable. A couple of years ago, I ran some sessions for a group of PhD candidates in Cambodia, the Royal University of Phnom Penh. And I had a wonderful collaborator working with me. She was helping me do the sessions and do the resources. And we had a sharing session with the students, with the candidates, and she showed us this huge whiteboard she had with post-it notes all over it. And what it came down to is she structured every moment of her week. And this was her accountability board, effectively. Every morning when she woke up, before she had breakfast, she'd read an article. Up went a post-it note with the details. After breakfast, she'd spend some time doing emails. She'd spend some time doing a little bit of writing. Up went another post-it note with some details. And she effectively structured, she planned her day kind of like a primary school timetable. You know, that's how I felt about it. And I said to her, did it work? You know, how did it help you? And she said, she wasn't a person who enjoyed routine much. She had many things to do, but she knew what they were. But she said by structuring it in such a way and making sure there was an accountability from each section, it actually became a habit for her. And as much as she didn't enjoy the process, it became habit that she just did it. Kind of like us going to work. You know, if we've not worked for a while or we've been happy being in the university environment, and then suddenly we go to a 9 to 5 job and we fit into those structures, we may grumble about it. But at the end of the day, the management of time actually becomes a habit, which leads to our hopefully working successfully. So in order to do something like this, I'm not saying get up, read an article before you have breakfast. If you're like me and you get up at 12 o'clock, there's no time. But just understand a few things. Make sure that the routine works for you. What time of the day is best for you to do certain things? I love doing my reading late in the evening, very early in the morning. So from like 9, 10 p.m. So around this time onwards for the next few hours is the time where I'm most productive if I'm trying to read or I'm trying to bring things together. If I'm writing, afternoons and evenings work well. So just understand what works for you, create that loose structure, and make that happen. Now that's, avoiding or trying to avoid procrastination. Is it always going to work? Absolutely not. But making steps towards it will help you develop that particular habit. You can go through, your daily task, creating goals that are smart. I'm sure all of us have seen this somewhere in our lives. Um, I don't want to teach, as I say, I don't want to teach grandma to suck eggs here, but there are some principles out of this. Being specific about what you need to be able to do within each time frame helps. Measuring it. Really, measurement is, did you achieve it or did you not? Don't say, I'm going to start writing or I'm going to do some writing, because that's so vague you can't measure it. I'm going to write a section of a chapter relating to this finding from my data. It's easy. It doesn't have to be good. It just has to be a section of the chapter that you can evolve into the future. You need to make sure it's attainable. Don't sit down and say, well, Craig, today I'm going to write chapter 2, because that's not going to happen. Although some of us might believe that we can do it, reality is, you break it down. If you came to my session at the end of 2023, I went through, when I talked about planning for this year and planning for milestones, I went through a resource from Dr. Chelsea Hetherington. And one of the parts of her resource was breaking down a big task from a chapter through to something you can do in a week, through to something you can do in a day. So breaking a big task down into multiple smaller tasks so that you can start snowballing the achievement. That's attainability. Break your tasks down so that you can see what or where you need to do. And to be honest, an achievement today might be, I wrote the chapter subheadings. Now, it may seem like nothing, but actually, if you've now mapped out your chapter subheadings and you know where you're heading, you already understand where the content is going. You already understand, tomorrow I need to do a section under that subheading, and you can develop and you can build from it. It needs to be relevant so it connects to what you're doing. And the best thing I can think of here is, every time I want to procrastinate on a big task, I rearrange the books on my bookshelf, or I rearrange the furniture in my office. So if it's a really big task, I will rearrange the furniture in my whole house. Totally irrelevant. I choose to do something that I say, oh, having an office environment that's alphabetized will make my life easier. No, because I forget how to do that. I'm just busying myself and pushing the real work away. So whatever you do is make sure it's relevant. The relevant part should be, I'm going to pick out of my really disorganized files 10 articles that I must focus on. Now that's irrelevant, because that becomes relevant because it links up with exactly what I do. Tidying my office, moving furniture doesn't. So make sure that what you're doing, what you're telling yourself you are doing, actually links in. And time bound. Give yourself a time frame. For example, am I going to complete this today? Is this a 30-minute task? Is this a 30-day task? Don't just say, I'm going to start writing today, because that's vague. I'm going to write a section on qualitative methodology, and I'm going to finish that by 3 p.m. tomorrow. So all of those definitions, all of those constraints help us to become a little bit more structured. Now, as I said, this is telling grandma to suck eggs because we all know this stuff. Nothing I've just said is new to anybody. The challenge, what's new for some of us, is how do we actually stick to it? How do we force ourselves to do it? And that's for you to solve. I can't provide that solution, but it is something that we can manage and overcome. Sometimes we create external motivation in order to increase our motivation and to avoid the procrastination that we have. And external motivation can be scheduling regular meetings with your supervisors, uh, doing writing support appointments, having a writing support group, giving yourself rewards. All of these we all know about. What we've got to decide is what one's going to work for us. When I talk about scheduling regular meetings with your supervisor, I'm going to give you a personal alternative to this, because I don't think spending time with your supervisor is always the best. But I'm a huge supporter of having a mentor, and regular accountability sessions with your mentor where all you're doing is getting together over coffee and just giving an update and talking about the latest aspects of your research, the challenges you face, the things you've enjoyed, all of that actually helps keep us up there, because most of us don't want to disappoint somebody we trust or somebody we empower as a mentor. So if we go along to a meeting and say, well, nothing's changed for 2 weeks, we often disappoint ourselves rather than disappointing the mentor. So it can be a way of helping that. Personally, writing support appointments, write anything that I would call an accountability group, where others, your peers, other PhD candidates, whether they be from the same university, whether they be friends you've met through the third degree, for example, keeping each other accountable and keeping each other motivated is way better than heading to your supervisor all the time. But think about how we can use that. Now, let's move on, because, there's a lot of project management and we know the motivation stuff to death, right? Another challenge for a dissertation is the project is large and complex. And even after you've simplified it, and I don't know if Savia is in the group tonight. If she is, this one's for you, Savia. Even after you've simplified your overall structure and you've got something that's manageable, it can still be a very complex project to be able to execute, and it might require certain things being executed at certain times. So I'm going to take liberty and use Savia as an example because I've spent quite a bit of time talking with her about her research. And she's doing educational research, which is very valuable, especially for where she is located. But it involves dealing with students. It involves dealing with teachers. It involves dealing with school administration, and it involves developing brand new teaching resources to improve on what is already in the market. Now, that's I want to say four stakeholders. I use that term loosely, right? But that's four stakeholders in a 1-year cycle of data collection. Now, it's not four stakeholders that you start with the students and then you move on to the teachers. It's four stakeholders that you have to work with at the same time from different angles for the same purpose. And that in itself becomes a problem. So we need to think about, what do I take from project management that can help me, I just want to say, manage the project, that can help me create a logical flow of activity that will make sure I don't miss anything out, that will make sure I'm addressing all of the issues that are of importance to my research and then develop. So what problems can a large, complex project cause? Okay. I don't even know how to explain this slide. As I said, coming from other people's slides, it's weird. But this is Thesaurus. I guess a big dinosaur of a thesis, which is just a lot to be dealing with. The fear can set off problems. Knowing there's so much to do, fear leads to avoidance, leads to guilt, which leads to reduced self-esteem, and ultimately, even down to imposter syndrome. What we've got to be able to do is take care of the fear first. It's complex, but if you break it down and you structure it and you schedule how you want it to do, and project management's a lot about scheduling stuff, you can actually work relatively simultaneously on different things and come up and achieve them at the end of what you're doing. So one of the things you can do is cut it down to size. And what I mean here, I wouldn't personally use the word cut down to size, but I would segment down to size. So when you look at something that's big, when you know you've got to deal with teachers and students and administrators, we know that the administrators will come first, so we schedule them first. What is actually required from administrators? You need to get their buy-in, you need to get their sign-off, and you need to give them an update. 3 little things. Schedule that across time. Then you need to deal with teachers next. What do you need to do with teachers? A, B, C. When we're doing B with teachers, we start working with students. So you can start scheduling it in. And even if you do not want to do a timetable here, because not everything has to be timetables, what it can be is mapping out the different tasks, how they're related to each other in terms of sequence and time, and then seeing when they need to be done by. So you can actually work in a very abstract way, but it still breaks it down to unique tasks. What you want to do, or what you really want to focus on, is taking a complex project and making it 100 steps or 200 steps or however many steps you need, but making it many steps, many little steps that are achievable, many little steps that you can work on 1, 3, and 7 today out of those steps, and that will get you moving forward. Now, the project management principle is really simple. Break down tasks. Yeah, we're just simply making things easier for ourselves. Now, what are the main tasks in your dissertation? So this is a challenge for us, and this is a question on that challenge. What are the main tasks in your dissertation? And, we've got a couple of cute little dinosaurs up here. Again, the big Thesaurus becomes 4 smaller ones, and the tasks are really simple. Research, writing, editing, and defending. Research is your data collection, if anything, but it goes a bit deeper. It's data analysis. But these are the 4 core things that you do. You collect data, you write about your findings from that data, you edit that so that it is communicable to others in a much nicer structure, and then you defend it. Now, we know the defense is right at the end, but as we're doing the research, the writing, and the editing, we should also be thinking about what might somebody ask us about this that I need to defend in that thing. When we break it down, the main tasks are not difficult. We have a research collection phase, we have an analysis, we have a writing phase, we have a tidying phase. It's actually quite easy to do. Now we've got to focus on what are the subtasks. Under data collection, what are the subtasks? 1, reaching out to respondents, reaching out to gatekeepers, conducting research on site, maybe a focus group, maybe interviews, maybe observational research, maybe surveys, writing, putting together, or writing involves reading first, uh, bringing together key findings from our data analysis, um, editing. Editing is twofold. One, it's making sure that we've been clear with what we want to express. Two, it's making sure that the overall structure of our writing tells a story, and at the same time as telling a story, conforms to our university's requirements for the structure of a thesis. And defending is about knowing where somebody may ask me a question. Now, if as I'm writing, I'm thinking somebody may ask me a question about this, a panelist on my Viva may ask me a question about this. That should also be a point at which I can say, you know what, Craig? Go back to the writing. I can answer this question before somebody else is going to ask it. So it kind of has that crossover. But at the end of the day, the tasks are not that huge. Now, if we go down to, we'll just pick a subtask under research, gatekeepers. That means we want to get a gatekeeper, so somebody in an organization or somebody who has a position of authority within a particular community to either get us in to get respondents or to keep us away. We've got to work out, well, so what's the strategy? We've got to identify who they are. We've got to approach them. We've got to supply them with information. We've got to get them to get buy-in, i.e. we're lobbying for their support to help us get those respondents. So we're breaking that down into different things. That might be an email. It might be visiting them at their office, taking them for coffee, having a really solid discussion with them about how your research will benefit them and their community members. All of that are subtasks that we've got to be able to think about. And we can go into the process of listing these down, or we can just do them in our head as well. But they're always going to be these things that we have to be able to think about. Now, in terms of here, this is just a different example to what I used for gatekeepers. So maybe I'm doing online research, field research, lab, archival. The subtasks are search for articles, read, travel to the site, set up some experiments, travel to the archives. All of these subtasks are very easy for us to identify, manage, and then say, you know what? I know I've got to do these. I can do them. And it's simply just making sure that we have a good understanding of what we have to do along the journey. If we look at possible writing subtasks, an introduction. Now, my nota bene here is sections are not necessarily written in this order, and there's a recursivity to the writing process that must be taken into account. Recursivity means we just keep going round in circles and come back to ourselves. It doesn't matter where you start. What matters is you start. When you break it down, I'll write a conclusion before I write an introduction. That doesn't work for everybody. And to be honest, even for me, it doesn't work all the time. Because I'll come back, I'll write the conclusion, I'll write the introduction, I'll write everything else, and I'll rewrite the conclusion. But I started, and I got the momentum going. And that's, an aspect of what you've got to think about. For some of us, if we're absolutely procrastinating, and this is something I actually have done previously, and it surprisingly worked. I was struggling to get my ideas onto paper. I knew what I wanted, but I just couldn't get there. So I went and wrote my reference list before anything else. And it may seem silly, you're putting out a reference list or a list of citations before you know you've used them. Now, this was in the days before we had Mendeley and EndNote and things like this, but it's still a good technique. Putting down that refreshes our mind about what the literature says. It means we're in the field, but we're not playing the game, so to speak. But it's still a starting point that is logical, that makes sense, and that is going to be a practical starting point. We could have some possible editing subtasks, meeting with a supervisor, a writing advisor, doing some feedback, copy editing, sorry. All of these are little things that we can do, but let's move on. Possible defending subtasks, so meetings with our supervisor, creating a presentation, practicing a presentation, mock defense, all of these help us to progress. Now, the next stage is really simple. We just estimate how much time each of our subtasks will take, because we should be able to be somewhat realistic about this. But it also means we can now start building a loose schedule to make things happen. Now, the project management principle out of that, which is, to me, I don't even want to call it a project management principle because we know what this is from our everyday life, but it's just estimate the time needed for completion for each part of your project. And it's building step by step by step a pathway, a direction for you. And if you find yourself going through and you're not meeting your timetable, you've got to evaluate on two levels. One, was I unrealistic with my timetable? And if the answer is no, you're realistic. The second one is, what am I doing that's preventing myself from actually doing the task at hand? So you can start reflecting on yourself for that. Now, in order to estimate time for completion for subtasks, understand the nature of the task. Can you complete it at your desk? Do you have to go somewhere? Is there a stable relationship between time invested in the end product? So if I put in 3 hours, do I get something that looks substantial? Does being able to start it depend on the completion of a prior task? Now, this is the one that we have to think about as researchers. I can't do my data collection until I get my research committee or ethics committee approval to do that, until I get approval from my university that says your approach, your research is acceptable. So some things require me to have that. I can't write a literature review chapter without having read the literature. So again, it's dependent upon a prior task. But do you know what? I can write, or I can start writing a literature review chapter having read only 10 articles. So it doesn't mean I have to read 200 and then I can start writing. I can start writing with 5 to 10 articles and I keep building from it. So there's an interrelationship. I do a bit of reading, I do a bit of writing. I do some more reading, I do some more writing. And it's a cyclical, continual relationship that happens. And some things are, how big is the subtask? So number of pages, degree to which the material must be processed. So if I'm reading, how do I think through it? If I've got data to actually work on, do I do my statistical analysis? How much involvement do I have to have in this in order to start making an output from it? Your past experience with the task. So this will help us plan it better. Have you the skills? Have you done it before? How long did similar tasks take in the past? Now, here's an important thing. So we all know that I'm a qualitative researcher and I'm proudly not quantitative. It doesn't mean I'm never going to be in a situation where numbers come into the factor or come into play for me. Now, if I do the data analysis on a set of surveys, how much time is it going to take me not only to do the data analysis, but to learn the software that I have to do? So I've got to factor in my own learning curve in part of this. But then I can also factor in a better solution. You know what? I know I'm terrible at data analysis, but I can employ a research assistant to help me do the data processing, to give me the results, and then I spend time learning how to analyze that and understanding what the results mean rather than how they were actually arrived at. So that's going to take me different sets of time, and I've got to factor that into it. You need to think about other commitments. Some of us are teaching. If you are teaching, congratulations, because I think that's the best experience you can get during a PhD journey. Some of us may be doing other work, other jobs. Fantastic. Just understand where your commitments are. It might be family commitments. You might have children or so forth. But knowing the commitments help. Now, having said, we're breaking down all of our tasks and we're looking at what we can do and we're trying to manage them in that way, always expand your estimates. So if you think it's going to take 6 hours to do a particular activity, it's going to take you 8 hours. Always be realistic with the fact that you probably need a little bit more time than what you think it's going to take. Now, we do this because as we try to plan, as we're creating that sort of that long-term plan for what we're doing, it's easier to finish something early, have some time, and bring everything up. When we have to delay everything else because we've been slow on something or because there is an interruption, then it kind of screws up our planning. It screws up our motivation as well in that respect. So the interesting suggestion here at the bottom of this slide is actually add 20%. So if it's going to take 10 hours, it's going to take 12 hours. The 20% I think is kind of fair, but know for yourself what your normal pattern is. For me, I'll add 50% because I know how slow and much of a procrastinator I can be. So here's an example about reading and summarizing 60 research articles. Not an unreasonable ask for a PhD student. I can complete it at my desk. It doesn't require me to have completed a prior task. I know on average it takes me an hour to read and summarize 10 pages of a research article in my field. That's probably not unreasonable as well. I have 15 hours a week for the task. That's 150 pages a week, or about 10 articles. So it'll take me 6 weeks to read and do 60 articles, plus 20%, 7 weeks. So if I start at the beginning of a month, I'll finish midway through the next month. Now, this is kind of a simple suggestion. Personally, I would not want to have all that reading lumped into one thing, but that may be how it has to be done, and it's not an unreasonable thing to ask. All I'm simply doing is saying, how much time do I realistically need to achieve a particular task block or block of tasks or a particular milestone? And I can calculate it out. I add in my buffer because I know things will happen. And this leads us to another project management principle, which is, I think, the last one I'm going to share about for tonight, and that's create a schedule. And I'm not a big fan of detailed schedules, but I am a fan of mapping out how things should be done and being relatively realistic about the time frames that they're there. So we can come through to what's called a Gantt chart. Probably many of us have seen them. I'm not going to suggest you need to do them as detailed as this, right down to the day or down to the time, but you can actually map out the activities that you need, and you can map out the relationship between the different activities and at what stages of your year or of your PhD journey these need to be done. So this one is reading versus writing, which is quite interesting. So I personally believe we should always be reading. Um, we don't jump into data collection phase and stop reading for a year. We have to keep ourselves up to date with everything that's there. But we might reduce the amount of reading we need to do, because rather than giving ourselves that whole solid foundation and finding all the gaps and everything, we're just keeping up with what the latest people, the latest research has said about what we're doing. The use of a planner like this is one that shows me what I have to do before I do something else. So if during my procrastination I decide to start on task 2.2, maybe there had to be something I needed to do beforehand. So I've sort of got a visual representation of that. What it does give me is the resources that I need to have access to. And it helps us think through, you know what, if I need resources for something, what's my time frame to access those resources? Who do I have to ask? Who do I need to get permission from? And so forth. And it also allows me, the complete incomplete thing simply allows me to say, you know what? I've done this. Now, something that I find very valuable, because most of us are heading for a finish line, and the finish line is the PhD, the Viva, getting success. But it's also those tiny little successes all the way along. So even here in my office, I have a to-do list. And often I write it on a whiteboard rather than a piece of paper. But I have a to-do list, and every time I cross something out, it gives me this sense of relief. It may have been the smallest task, but knowing that I completed something, knowing that I'm a step further towards where my goal is actually very rewarding. And we've got to learn as researchers, although the end goal is absolutely what we want, and by all means, you do not take your sights off that end goal. But what we should be looking at is every time we have a little success, every time we complete an activity, we need to celebrate those little wins. Now, this is kind of a mental health thing as well. So if you're coming next week, you might hear the same speech. But we've got to remind ourselves that every little milestone that we achieve, every task that we complete, is one task closer to that major goal that we've got. And sometimes that really does help us with the motivation, because although I have 23 things left on my to-do list today, I had 34 things when I started today. So I did good. And that is intrinsically, it does help us in that respect. Now, I'm sort of just going to move on. We've got a couple more slides before I go into a Q&A session with this one. We can use project management software. So there are software that's available that will help us. And the reference there will probably help. I'm going to share these slides on our social media, through LinkedIn, through our WhatsApp chat group, and so forth by tomorrow. So you can certainly come and have a look at that. But there's different types of software, whether it be collaborative for just communication, whether it be tracking issues, so updates on certain things, even to the point, this is like an annotated bibliography and tracking key points and whether you've referenced it, whether you've included it in your literature review chapter or whatever. We have scheduling software for Gantt charts, resource management so that we can make sure we're booking our labs, that we're, making sure we're getting things in a very structured way. Document management system, can't emphasize how valuable this can be. If I was to show you my computer hard drive from the time I did both my master's and my doctorate, oh boy, version 1.1, version 1.1 edited on, version 1.1 edited on, re-edited on. My document management system was absolutely crap, possibly some of the worst you might ever experience. Today, it's not so bad. I have 2 hard drives and a computer desktop. I'm working between all 3. It's an improvement. Having a system that really helps manage the edits, i.e. the updates you do to your text, because never ever throw away something that you've deleted, just in case you might want it back. But always having the latest version and being able to access it, always having it structured, always having your data files easy to access, easy to work with, becomes very important. And part of a project management approach can simply be just how you look after your files that are needed for what you're doing. And if that's the only thing you do, it's still a really positive thing. And the final one, workflow system. Now, this is really for, notifying group members when something's happened, but it can work for us. Say, for example, we're doing surveys, and maybe we've hired 2 or 3 research assistants to help us with our surveys. We want to know when they've completed a particular batch of surveys in a particular location or so forth. So we want to have things that are, sorry, as up to date as we possibly can from that. And this leads us to, I guess, the final project management principle to think about, and that's monitoring your progress. Are you meeting your deadlines? If not, why not? Do you need to revise your estimates? The good one is, are you being a perfectionist? So for many of us, we try so hard to be a perfectionist rather than to be productive that perfectionism overtakes output. So if you're a perfectionist, acknowledge that fact and then think, you know what, I need to finish. I don't need to finish beautifully. I need to finish first, then I can perfect everything. And that's why editing to me is the absolute last thing we do, because editing is your chance to be a perfectionist. It's your chance to choose your words. It's your chance to answer any unanswered questions. It's your chance to evolve anything that you've got from it. Are you lacking motivation? How can I address that for myself? What do I need to do to get myself motivated? Sometimes I need to take a 2-week holiday by the beach. That's fine. But when you come back, you've got to do the work. Is a critical phase of the process stalled so that you can't proceed further? And then that helps you say, well, actually, what are the roadblocks that I have with that? And if for whatever reason your progress, is stalled, don't hide it from your supervisor. So communicate. And this is the last project management principle. Always communicate with the stakeholders. So if you're feeling that it's not going to plan, if you're feeling like you can't move forward, it is time to say to your supervisor, I'm experiencing this. What are some possibilities for me to evolve from that and to be able to move forward from that? Now, that's kind of where I'm heading into a Q&A session.